for the next 2 weeks on tape, tape 432, 40 to 33, and maybe for 3 weeks in a row, I'm going to stick with ABSCAM. No matter what the news is or how it breaks, it's so important to go into these investigations that are breaking at this time. I have at least 150 articles that are important on this subject, and it's so massive, and it covers so many states and personalities, starting with the President of the United States on down. But I'm going to stick with that, with the exception of a few articles that are terribly important that I'll throw in, and then I'll get back to the murder of the Jonestown witnesses, the California kidnappings, and a lot of important stories. But this is an election year, and I'm sure that candidates and congressmen, members of the House of Representatives and the Senate are terribly worried about the possible stories of organized crime and the Justice Department investigation of mobsters around the country, because even if they go for a few underlings in exchange for immunity, they may name the biggies. And I believe that just as we get large stories such as, I think Alternative 3 was an important one, the Rockefeller murder, the Paisley disappearance, Jonestown. I do series sometimes, 1, 2, or 3 tapes. We're going to get right into the ABSCAM arrest and stay with him for a few weeks, and I will get back to other material as soon as I can, but I want to cover some of these stories with you. There were just several articles, too, that I wanted to mention before I get to the narcotics investigations and the ABSCAM. One is an article from the Washington Post. Well, there are 2 this week. President sparing the Pentagon from budget scissors. We're cutting all over the country. Our programs, enrichment programs, libraries, transportation is needed. Our alternative energies, health plans, everything. Jimmy Carter was a graduate of Annapolis. Don't ever forget that. He will not cut a bit from the Army, the Navy, the Air Force. He's not getting us the energy that we need or going into the problems of even how to get rid of pollution, other than sending it overseas to Africa and Sierra Leone and Chile. They've come up with no great solutions on how to get rid of the waste that we're creating. One article in the Washington Post this week, weapons costs up $28.8 billion in the fourth quarter. 48 major weapon programs soared $28.8 billion in the last 3 months. That's what it cost for 48 programs, if you can believe it. Army Black Hawk helicopter, $2.1 billion. Navy anti-submarine warfare helicopter system, $1.6 billion. Army's XM-1 tank, $1.6 billion. The Air Force A-10 close support fighter, $1.2 billion. This is a warfare president, and he's going to keep making those things, and we won't be able to use them, and this country is going down the drain. By the time the people catch on, they'll be such victims of mind control, they won't have the energy to fight this stupidity. Jack Anderson had an article, March the 6th, this is Thursday, March the 6th, 1980, U.S. refuses refugees, the Iranian Jews. He talks about Jimmy Carter meeting with Cyrus Vance, Secretary of State, and deciding they cannot open the door to 100 Jewish refugees. Not 100 families, 100 refugees. The article quotes, the Jews have been put on a back burner. One insider explained, human rights interest to let them in is not part of the national interest, end quotes. That's from the State Department. Jack Anderson said there are ugly overtones in the attitude of the U.S. consular officials abroad who've been petitioned by Iranian Jews for visas, and they talk about the antagonism, and one congressional observer said it's like Germany in the 1930s when immigration red tape prevented Jews from escaping Adolf Hitler's Holocaust. The excuse of Jimmy Carter is that he doesn't want to antagonize Mr. Khomeini, who's held our people hostage for 6 months. They don't want to antagonize Khomeini. I don't believe that he would kill or hurt the hostages if the Iranian Jews came to this country. They just don't want the Jews, period. The anti-Semitism is any different than it was in the 1930s. There's an article in the San Francisco Chronicle this week, Rosalyn, Chief Aide and Advisor to Jimmy Carter, by Gail Sheehy. This was March the 11th, 1980, and they talked about how close she is with Jimmy, how she never challenges him, and they talked about the Shah, or whether to admit him in the country, and Mrs. Carter agreed that that was the right decision. And now they talk about the possibility of war. Quotes, "Oh, I can imagine war," she told me. "Jimmy would not hesitate to go to war to defend the honor of the country." They went on and asked her where she was getting her information about what is necessary for the honor of the country. But these people are war people. Jimmy Carter's sister, Ruth, goes to the Middle East with this Mr. McBurney, Reverend McBurney from California, a far-right extremist who claims that the next war is bound to happen in the Middle East, that it's written in the Bible, that this is a prophecy, and Jimmy is fulfilling the prophecy by making the war in the Middle East. He's very close to his sister, and they believe that this is inevitable, and she and her husband sit back and believe that they would do defense of this country. Now, would Jimmy Carter, as I said in November when the hostages were first taken, go to war if he thought the election were close? Would he cancel the election? Would he instigate a war at this time and sacrifice the hostages after the election or just before? You bet your last bottom dollar he would. He is the first president to graduate from Annapolis. He's prepared for the war. That's what he was selected for by Mr. Brzezinski, the trilateralists, the Bilderbergers, and I don't believe he would hesitate to go to war. He's sitting there now, and it's very good for campaigning to keep the situation going on and on. I also mentioned a while back that Jimmy Carter has been blamed by the Shah of Iran for his being ousted, that he blames directly Jimmy for not giving them support he needed. And I brought up the conflict that Jimmy Carter represents the banking, the Rockefeller interests, the international bankers in the North, and he also represents the drug dealers in the South from Atlanta, Georgia, his own home turf that is heavy into assassination teams and drug dealing. An article in the LA Times this last week, a UPI story, Carter reportedly cut Iran clergy funds. Now, the CIA was paying $400 million a year to the clergy in Iran to keep quiet and love the Shah, and they were giving $10 million a year of our taxes to King Hussein in Jordan to keep quiet and keep control over his people. This is CIA money, and when the story of the Jordanian funds came out, Jimmy Carter told the CIA to stop paying the religious leaders of Iran. Imagine what we would do for rapid transit if we had that $400 million a year that's been going on since 1953 to clobber the heads of the people in order to keep the Shah in power for a little bit of Iranian oil. Jimmy Carter called off the payoffs to these priests, and then, according to these articles, when he halted that money, then the Shah was on his way out. So you might almost say that various actions that he took were responsible for coaxing the Shah out. When the Shah left, the drug traffic increased, and as we get into ABSCAM, and I repeated this on many tapes, many articles over and over again, drug fighters warn that heroin flooding this country from what they call that Golden Crescent, Afghanistan, Iran, and Pakistan. Ever since the Shah of Iran was out and Jimmy Carter had eased him out, the flow of heroin in this country has just increased over 100% from what it was last year and when the Shah was removed. One large article, big upsurge in drug traffic through the Khyber Pass. And it said even though the Soviet Union is in Afghanistan, the drugs are going into Iran, they're going into Pakistan, they're going both ways. The Afghans are raising the poppy, and they're able to take their crops freely. They're produced in Afghanistan, and they're flowing in two directions, the opium and so forth. I'm sure the Soviet Union might allow this because look what it's doing to our country and our cities as it reaches Europe and reaches the United States and is pouring into our cities. It goes into the tobacco merchants, opium, hashish, marijuana, and how freely it's moving. And it says since the Shah was out, the government has allowed the increase of the drug traffic and the flow, and now the hard drugs that were banned even in Pakistan until last October are flowing out. The Pakistani law until last October banned hard drugs, but now it's just pouring out in all directions from Afghanistan to Iran, Afghanistan to Pakistan, and the crops are flowing directly now into the East Coast and into the United States. Jack Anderson has an article this week, March the 11th, 1980, The Real ABSCAM. He talks about While the prosecutions are going on in Washington, D.C., the FBI agents employed for their various arrests, genuine Arab petrodollars are occurring around the White House. And he specifically says the White House. And last week I referred again that ABSCAM is the Cartergate. This is Jimmy Carter's links to organized crime that, if it's investigated properly will keep flowing. And Jack Anderson talks about the Arab scams close to home, implicating members of President Carter's personal and political family. And it goes into quotations of various members of the ABSCAM who were caught, Representative Kelly and Myers and Frank Thompson, Democrat from New Jersey. But then the biggies are mentioned by Jack Anderson. He talks about the Libyan connections of Billy Carter with Gaddafi, and I've talked about that briefly. He talks about the Libyans giving expensive gifts to Billy. He is a lobbyist for Libya, and Gaddafi is very much part of the international terrorist organization that's also linked to drug traffic and gun running. And it talks about the release of airplanes, the $60 million worth of U.S. transports that were to go to Libya, and the use of Billy Carter as the ambassador or the catalyst to try and get these airplanes delivered to Gaddafi. Several weeks ago, back in December, I talked about the arrest of Frank Turpel and George Carcola from Washington, D.C. and New Jersey, assassination teams involved with narcotics and guns that they supplied through the Middle East, linked to this entire operation, the Gaddafi operation linked to Billy Carter. That's probably why their arrest, since their arrest, we haven't read a thing about them in the newspaper for national security purposes. Jack Anderson talks about the Robert Vesco caper. He doesn't give a reader who has not followed the career of Robert Vesco the background of how corrupt Vesco is, but he mentions how Vesco is trying to work with Gaddafi and get these airplanes that are needed. Also, Jimmy Carter's White House is being investigated for possible payoffs in order to keep Vesco from coming to the United States. Vesco is giving Jimmy Carter's group money so that he doesn't get extradited for his crimes and shenanigans. And then Jack Anderson mentions the Burt Lance case going on in Atlantic City. That was the Office of Management Budget Chief of the United States Jimmy Carter had until he was removed from office, and the links of Burt Lance to Saudi Arabian businesses and the Saudi Arabian officials bringing in money to bail him out of his bank problems down in New Jersey. Then when he had to be bailed out, that they brought in a lot of money for a multi-million-dollar favor for a man such as Burt Lance, who was close to Jimmy Carter. This article, this one particular one by Jack Anderson, goes into the Security and Exchange Commission looking into the illegality of banking firms in Washington with real Arabs and lots of millions of dollars that are directly involved to the White House family, and the source of funds that put Jimmy Carter into office down in Georgia. The Burt Lance affair is going on. His Washington, D.C. attorney was subpoenaed this week. His name is Robert Altman. Altman is an associate of the former Secretary of Defense Clark Clifford. Clark Clifford was the gentleman who was making speeches over in Pakistan and Middle East about several weeks ago about ready to go to war in the Persian Gulf. He's described as one of the worst warmongers. He's worked with the CIA and the Pentagon, the Defense Department, all of his political career, and the attorney for Burt Lance is the associate of Clark Clifford, the great warmonger. Burt Lance and his co-defendants down in Georgia, incidentally, are accused of 33 counts of misapplying bank funds, falsifying loan records, and defrauding the government to gain $20 million in bank loans. But it doesn't tell you how much money was bailed out by the oil sheiks over in Saudi Arabia. When you realize that they could bail out Burt Lance and come in with millions of dollars to be close to Jimmy Carter, you can see why Jimmy Carter can change the wording in a new UN resolution about Israel, because there's direct Arab money into the banks that funded Jimmy Carter, and it's pouring into Georgia and everywhere else at all levels, and that's why he can turn his back on Israel and say it was a mistake when everybody realizes the actions he took last week were not a mistake at all. And if Jimmy Carter is being funded by Middle East oil sheiks and Arabs, you can see why he will not let 100 Jews come into this country. It's an exact rerun of the Adolf Hitler State Department policies, as I say, that took place before, and there's money directly coming in from that part of the world into rescuing Jimmy Carter's buddies and their shenanigans that is, again, fund the president through those banks. The grand jury is investigating this week some more. Hamilton Jordan, that's chief of staff of the White House. Jordan allegedly was in New York City and asked for cocaine where it could be obtained, and a man known as Johnny C., a reputed drug dealer, according to the New York Times, allegedly supplied the cocaine to Hamilton Jordan and also to the chauffeur who drove Mr. Jordan and his companions around New York City on their visit. The Georgia Bumpkins go up to New York City to Club 54, which is managed by Roy Cohn and another side of the drug faction. I'm sure there's a big feud in the various people, the drug marketeers between each other, and he walks right into that trap in New York City, and Johnny C. supplies the cocaine, and that's being investigated right now. And of course, I've mentioned on other tapes that John Ellsworth, the Drug Enforcement Agency, who worked with Jimmy Carter, who has direct contact with Yasser Arafat, with plans to take over all the hashish growing and trafficking out of Lebanon. This Mr. Ellsworth was photographed with Rosalyn Carter, as was Jim Jones, another gun runner, drug trafficker down in Guyana. Rosalyn Carter was photographed with Ellsworth, and she was also photographed with a Brooklyn mobster, Jimmy Esposito. Right after they were with the Carters, and she was at their education fund, Jimmy Esposito and James Esposito were both shot. This was in October of last year, and allegedly they were shot because they were too upfront with the Carters and photographed at a time where they weren't supposed to be so obvious. Mr. Ellsworth's friends, he has 16 friends that were indicted in New York just in April on conspiracy charges involving marijuana, cocaine, and hashish. This fellow was in the White House, photographed with Rosalyn Carter, and as I say, the Esposito son, and then the father. One was photographed with her, and then both were killed. The drug connections of ABSCAM could reach all over and undo what I call the Cartergate if it keeps going right. Another article, February 24th, 1980, the San Jose Mercury, talking about the geographical areas that are supporting Jimmy Carter: New York, Florida, Georgia, Texas, and the District of Columbia. Of course, all heavily involved in drug traffic. They list people supporting Carter: Morris Schenker, the Teamsters Union president, Jimmy Hoffa's defense attorney, owner of the Dunes Hotel Casino in Las Vegas, and the holder of $100 million in Teamsters pension fund loans. Now, Morris Schenker is one of the people behind Jimmy Carter, and this comes at a time when Senator Howard Cannon and Mr. Dorfman of the Teamsters Pension Fund are being linked to deaths in the Teamsters Union, extortion, and a long list of crimes that connects to other areas of ABSCAM around the country. Also listed contributing Jimmy Carter, the usuals like General Motors, American Telephone, Coca-Cola, Bechtel, and so forth. They list among the 334 lawyers Louis Nizer, who wrote the introduction to the Warren Report, the first one in 1964, who has concealed Nazis in this country and worked with the highest levels of conspiracy and the intelligence community. And then they give another supporter, Clark Clifford, and refer to him. Again, that's the attorney team representing Burt Lance as the Persian Gulf saber rattler, Clark Clifford, behind Jimmy Carter, and Peter Echeverria, former Nevada gambling regulator, and Stephen Aiello, A-I-E-L-L-O, of New York, White House Ethnic Affairs aide, and former chairman of the Education Committee. That's that old group with John Ellsworth and the Espositos. That was the Education Committee. And they said this group was a creation of late organized crime figure Joseph Colombo of New York City. Those are the people behind, just a few of them, behind Jimmy Carter that were mentioned in the San Jose Mercury last week. Jack Anderson's getting pretty good on the Carter drug connections. He's closing in like he did with Richard Nixon and Watergate, starting with the ITT memos, and he's making a lot of good articles closing in. I mentioned last week, March the 3rd, he talked about Interior Secretary Cecil Andrus and his links to the Mafia and organized crime. John Bender, the Idaho chief lawman, who was appointed by Andrus, and the mob connections in the state of Idaho that the FBI warned Jimmy Carter about the appointment of Andrus and how he went through with it anyway, and thus spreading some more organized crime to Idaho. And I mentioned Emprise, the group. There are a syndicate of organized crime that were responsible for killing Don Bowles in Arizona. I'll do more tapes on Emprise. Somebody, one of the listeners wrote and asked me to do some more on Emprise. I'll do that, but I don't want to get off on that tangent now. I want to go more into the ABSCAM story. One last article by Jack Anderson this last week, Casinos for Carter. President Carter, a born-again Christian who doesn't gamble, is raking in the chips when it comes to campaign contributions from the Las Vegas gambling strip. Money from Caesar's Palace, the Desert Inn, the MGM Grand Hotel, the Jockey Club, the Circus Hotel, Lady Luck Casino, the Dunes Hotel. The president's most enthusiastic backer is Caesar's Palace. Everyone, it seems, from owner to secretary, gave $1,000 contributions to Carter's chances for a second term. Except for the Dunes, none of the casinos so far that have given to Carter have figured in the ongoing FBI investigation of the gambling operation. As Jack Anderson says, none of them so far, but wait a while if it's done right. The New Jersey and the Las Vegas connections will fit together like hand in glove. And of course, Carter has worked for this group, this great born-again Christian who prides himself in his Sunday school teaching, doesn't think a thing of extortion, murder, prostitution, blackmailing, mugging, and violence of the worst kind. He condones war and he condones organized crime because he is leaning towards the warfare state every single day. He's getting closer to World War III, and he also is overtly linked, photographs, personality and wise and so forth, to these people from organized crime that seem to be solidly behind them. That doesn't mean that other presidents aren't being supported by crime. The greatest fraud in the country is Ronald Reagan trying to look Mr. Clean, having his campaign run by Paul Lassault from Nevada. But Reagan has never been photographed with so many mob figures or been linked in all the years of whatever he's done. He hasn't had this many open links to organized crime that Jimmy Carter has. And it comes at a time where Jimmy Carter has opened up through his State Department the flow of the narcotics through Iran, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, just as we had double inflation with Jimmy Carter as president. And goodness knows I don't like Gerald Ford. As president of the United States, the inflation and the problems in this country were so much worse, even with Jimmy Carter, that it's at a panic level. And the drug problem increased with the inflation also. He brought in much more of the drugs and narcotics through his political decisions and the people he associates with, his whole Middle Eastern crowd and the policies he's done. He's responsible for this narcotic traffic and the prostitutions and the murders and the things they're going to follow. That's why it's so important for the FBI and the Justice Department to nip some of this, which they've been wanting to do and never could do under J. Edgar Hoover. It's so important that the ABSCAM investigations not be halted and hushed up because, as one member in Congress said, if this goes properly, it will involve 50% of the Congress of the United States. New Solidarity, put out by the Labor Party, Labor Caucus, had an article last week, February 19th, using the Army to fight dope. And they had a message that was sent originally to their National Anti-Drug Coalition in Detroit, Michigan, September 1979, by an Army major, Fiumano, and his suggestion was that we bring in the United States Army, the helicopters, the Grumman aircraft, to fight organized crime or fight the dope traffic in the United States. Last week I quoted the National Labor Party by saying that ABSCAM, with their express purposes of getting murderers, criminals, drug traffickers, extortionists, they're accused of bringing in a Gestapo in the United States, and then the next week, totally contradictory, they say, use the Army to fight the dope. I would prefer the Justice Department to the Army. The Army brought in the most dope from the Southeast Asian War in Vietnam, through Air America, through the bodies of corpses. Organized crime has vending machines on every Army base. and organized crime have gone hand in glove. And if ABSCAM is the Gestapo, is the legal method of catching people like Carlos Marcello, the Immigration Department, or various members of Congress who are involved in dope and corruption, if the Justice Department can do it, they should do it. When you get the Army bringing in the dope dealers, then you really have a problem. This article by Michael Steinberg ends with a quotation of a letter, as I said, that was sent to the meeting in Detroit, Michigan, and it says, "Please review the military capability of the military forces available to the United States. Lynn, meaning Lyndon LaRoche, my grateful thanks to you for your support and everybody here. May the peace of Christ be with you. All that's from my religion and you and your religion. Thank you very much." I get very suspicious when we get letters about the peace of Christ and we suggest that the United States Army and the Army Air Force and so forth be the ones to go after organized crime and dope, particularly with the past history, as I say, of the Army with dope. There was an excellent article in the Village Voice by Wayne Barrett and Jack Newfield on the arrests on ABSCAM. It's called Notes on ABSCAM, and it refers to Tom Puccio, Puccio, 11-year federal prosecutor in organized crime in New York City. And it defends Puccio where he was being attacked by various people right away as soon as the ABSCAM arrest came down. And they pointed out that he resisted the efforts of Robert Del Tufo, that's the U.S. Attorney in New Jersey, to not arrest Senator Harrison Williams. Del Tufo didn't want to arrest Harrison Williams, and Del Tufo is the man that was appointed by Jimmy Carter, I mentioned once before on a tape, as the U.S. Attorney in New Jersey, and he wanted to drop the charges. And this particular Senator Williams is involved with the London casinos. We'll get to those in a little while, where the high-rolling Arabs and internationals come to their 7 clubs, and they're opening up a club through special favors that they received by Senator Williams and his wife, who's on the Senate staff that works with him. They got permission to open up a club in New Jersey. So London moves to New Jersey, and this Del Tufo wanted to drop the ABSCAM investigations, and yet Tom Puccio went into them. They also quoted in the Village Voice a Justice Department lawyer, Representative Charles Bennett, who's on the House Ethics Committee, who independently said that they were investigating Congressman Murphy and Jen Rett. I briefly mentioned those men before, and they said that they were under investigation, one, Jen Rett, for federal drug smuggling, and Congressman Murphy is a subject of an active investigation as a member, one of the 2 American citizens, directors for the foundation of the Shah, the Pahlavi Foundation. He allegedly took kickbacks in 2 real estate deals involving the Pahlavi Foundation. One had to do with negotiating the possible purchase of the Seagram's building in New York City, and it fell through, and the kickback questions being investigated. Congressman Murphy and Jen Rett were troublemakers before, and the fact that Tom Puccio could go after them and try to get an indictment, which the federal prosecutors haven't done for 3 years, is something that the Village Voice called attention to that shouldn't be put down. William Webster, the director of the FBI, was called before Congress this week to defend the ABSCAM operation, and he said the only way you can catch people on bribery and so forth in undercover operations is the type of work that they were doing, where these various goodies were offered and the men fell for it and went to it. And he claimed before the congressional committees that he wasn't baiting these people. He said the middlemen themselves were target of FBI investigations and that they were going to be arrested, and that they named politicians who they said, in quotes, they controlled. And the middlemen discovered and then introduced these particular politicians to the FBI. This was an answer to Don Edwards, a former FBI agent from San Jose, who's a member of Congress, and the Banana family and organized crime family is thick in the San Jose area, and Don Edwards is getting a little panicky about this investigation. The only people who would be panicky are those that would be involved in it. The middlemen weren't used as bait. The middlemen were men under investigation who began to speak and said, these are the men we own, and they proved it to the FBI by these men coming over and over again for visits and gladly stuffing money into their pockets. On the other side of this tape, we'll get into more of ABSCAM, the scandalous investigations going on at the present time. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's tape number 432, March the 14th, 1980, and it's side 2 of the tape. There are a lot of investigations of organized crime figures coming out in the news now. They're going to be bursting out like popcorn, and then at some point, hopefully, they'll link together just at the time of Watergate, after the men were arrested at the hotel. It seemed like an operation that just involved some Republicans and Democrats at the Watergate Hotel, and then it carried out all over the country to various dirty trick operations, and even in Beverly Hills, going into the offices of Dr. Lewis Fielding, and Watergate became a national, international story of agents and people. And that's the way the ABSCAM story is going to break. There was an article in the Associated Press this last week, March the 9th, 1980. FBI bug reveals secret world of mob leaders. It goes into the business of crime, organized crime, and 5 men that met. They were part of the Cosa Nostra in Kansas. And that this Kansas City link will go to 2 Las Vegas casino executives, Joe Agosta and Carl Thomas, and how they met in Kansas City and talked about illegal casino money, Swiss bank accounts, under-the-table money, and so forth. They even referred to Jimmy Carter and his failure to control some money, and they said the economics is that all we're doing is printing money. They're printing out some money. These men are involved in mob murders, racketeering, casino skimming, and they're also linked to the Teamsters Union and officials and other mob leaders. So as we get to the Teamsters and Jimmy Carter, this will close into a network of crime throughout the United States that until now has been protected. An interesting thing on their tapes is that the Sicilian Italians refer to non-Italians in the operations that they're going into now. They have a slang word, it's called peckerwoods. And according to this article, those are outside guys that they never had to deal with. And they show apprehension in the tape recording of working with those. Peckerwood is a slang term for a non-Italian person. And this one article says that the Teamsters, mobsters that they were investigating were U.S. citizens of Sicilian ancestry, and that they talked on their tapes, when they were tape recorded, about preferring Sicilians and other Italians, and that they were going to have to share their business with non-Italians. And the Italian mobsters talked about people of Lebanese descent and people from the Middle East, and they were a little bit leery about, they had some not very nice things to say about these people. They're so honorable, such as you can't trust them, and they're not very honorable, as if the organized crime group have such a great distinction for honor. They also talked about staging a murder, getting their disguises, their wigs, the mustache, the beard, and so forth. But the conflict of the Italian, Sicilian, Cosa Nostra, Vegas, Teamster, mobster group worrying about the moving in of the Middle Easterners is picked up on the tape. And those Kansas City tapes will bring in certain people that, again, link to Georgia and the Southwest and Las Vegas, Nevada. Also, another article I got from a subscriber to the tapes, New York Post, March the 4th, 1980, how cops bugged a whole street. They not only bugged an area in Kansas City to pick up these conversations, but this is a long article in the New York Post, a secret report on Galante probe. They wanted to find out about the murder of Carmen Galante. They were focusing on that, and they had to go to Little Italy in New York City, and they had cops inside an automobile and buildings across the street. And this investigation, according to the New York Post, brought to light 8 hoodlum associates of Della Croce, who heads the Carlo Gambino crime family. I mentioned the Gambino on tapes, many times linked to the Scotto prosecution investigation in New York City. The Jimmy Carter links to the Michael Sindona trial, and various families that the Carters have been seen with. The Gambino name comes out. Mr. Esposito was one of them. The crime families are coming forward, and the entire street was bugged to try to get information on a planned murder and the murdering of an extortion. taking over money from various people and how you wipe them out, and contract murders and so forth. So that Mulberry Street, the entire street was bugged to get information and pull in a group of people that, again, will link to the ABSCAM connections. They're separate articles today, but they'll fit together in time. That's why it's so important to get some of this material now so we can follow it as it unfolds. Remember, Martha Mitchell said the White House is the Mafia, and I'm sure this would be true of many of the candidates that run for office of President of the United States and have the support of these characters, but it seems that Mr. Webster is trying to close in on them now and expose and arrest, and at least they're bugging them and bringing them in. There was an article in the New York Times this week about Michael Sindona, that character from Manhattan who's involved in the collapse of the Franklin National Bank. Sindona was a protege of Pope Paul VI and the Milan Mafia, then went on to do investment banking for the Vatican with American corporations linked to organized crime in the Gambino family. States, when the Pope came to this country, John Paul II, Sindona went away. He claimed he was kidnapped. Now the New York Times says that he had an alias. He used the name of Joseph Bonamico, that he violated his bail conditions, that he flew to Vienna August the 2nd when he disappeared, that he went to Munich, he went to West Germany and Frankfurt October the 13th, and then came back to New York, went TWA, and returned back flight 741. It's amazing how much information they had and how they let this person, they had his fingerprints and handwriting analysts checking him out. This Sindona is the same character that I said was put in jail the night the ABSCAM story broke, the night that 33 people were killed in New Mexico, and the informants were all killed on a particular wing. Michael Sindona was put into jail for the first time, and now they say that he did go to these cities. It's interesting that he didn't go to Milan or Sicily or seems the home base where he'd be operating from, but he's very international. He flew to Vienna, Munich, West Germany, and Frankfurt, then back to New York City for his trial. 2 people have been indicted so far in the ABSCAM. They're the first indictments. One is an investigator with Immigration and Naturalization Service, Alexander Alexandro. The other man is a businessman, Long Island businessman, who also has been indicted in this ABSCAM investigation. He's the second person that they've closed in so far, Alfred Carpenter, a businessman, charged with receiving bribe receiving and conspiracy to commit bribery with the Immigration Department. Mr. Alexander received $2,000 as payment on a $15,000 bribe, and he's been publicly identified with the ABSCAM operation and also with federal agents, undercover agents such as Tony DeVito and Melvin Weinberg. They haven't yet come out and said the role that he had in the bribery, Alexandro, but Mr. Weinberg links to Senator Williams and the British group that are coming in to put the casino in New Jersey. And so Alexander, 30 years old from Long Island, has put up bail. He's out, and Mr. Carpenter is also under indictment. Those are the first 2. Wayne Barrett in the Village Voice wrote an article this last week objecting to all the criticism of the FBI and Justice Department and the crime force going after these characters of organized crime. And there was a lot of vocal complaint about these leaks coming out, naming people and ruining their characters. And he called attention to the hypocritical fact that they complain about the leaks. And this is from the Village Voice. He said, had the charges against the White House Watergate cadre not been prematurely disclosed, as in the case of the ABSCAM, before their indictments, who could say what the case might have been or where it would cut off? It is as if the early Watergate disclosures had merely produced a prosecutor to hunt down the deep throat, end quotes. And so that they are putting down those people that criticize the leaks because by having the story out, the Justice Department couldn't backtrack, and there is some value in having people investigate these stories and getting out in the newspaper before the entire story can be killed. And it also helps other people bring in new information. That's what happened with Watergate. As it snowballed, more information kept coming in. Some people are going to get off from this investigation. Some important people won't get all of them, but some will be swept in, and maybe some of the corruption temporarily will be halted. At least it'll scare a few people that they just might go off to the clink. The New York Times had an article that last week, was February the 16th. U.S. dropped a fraud case because of the ABSCAM unit. They asked them to drop it. The federal government was looking into 16 months. For 16 months, 4 men that were accused of a $17 million banking fraud. Now, that's a lot of money, $17 million banking fraud. But they had to drop the case at the suggestion of the investigative unit of ABSCAM, because if they went into it, they would have broken the ABSCAM case open. It involved 4 men who sold $200 million worth of false forged certificates of deposit. It involved a bank in the West Indies. And when they got tangled with the Abdul Enterprises, which was the ABSCAM story, they had to drop the charges. The 4 men were arrested at LaGuardia Airport October the 4th, 1978, but the federal court, on the suggestion of the government, dropped the case. It involved the International Bank and Trust Company of London, based in St. Vincent, the British West Indies. The 4 men were arrested for illegal acts and a lot of money going down the drain, but somebody, by the grace of God, stepped in, and maybe they're the most important links, and the charges were dropped. But they were delivering false forged certificates that involved, as I say, $200 million, and the federal government dropped the charges on them. I was never excited about the Watergate investigation because it left off all the important things and just caught a few people at the time. But I'm very happy that any investigations go on at all, and there always is the chance that more will follow. If you open the door, you can do more investigating than if you close it entirely and let these things continue. We're talking about murders, extortion, blackmail, security exchange, fraudulent stocks, all kinds of fraudulent manipulations that run into billions and billions of dollars of traffic, prostitution, gambling, narcotics, and counterfeiting, forging, you name it. So that anything that's done is better than ignoring this, which J. Edgar Hoover did all the years that he was in the FBI. He worked with them, therefore he ignored them. The week before the ABSCAM story broke, I was talking about that William Taub that worked with the CIA and organized crime in the Vatican, and the pictures that he had that were stolen by the Teamsters, so that the stolen art story was in my mind when ABSCAM broke, and I went into some detail about that on past tapes. I did mention a man that was killed in New York City, a New York art dealer, Richard Coleman, who was murdered. And February the 24th, 1960, the New York Times has an update on the article. The 26-year-old lawyer by the name of Stephen Sladek, S-Z-L-A-D-E-K, of Brooklyn, was also murdered in the apartment. They didn't name for a week or so who was murdered along with Mr. Coleman, but he had original oils and Rubens and Titians, one worth $2.3 million in the apartment. He had valuable antiques and works of art, and according to the New York Times, they did not rule out robbery as a motive, so we don't know what oil paintings, if any, were taken. They suggested, some articles suggested they were taken, others said no, but in addition to Richard Coleman being murdered, there was an attorney at the house, and I think that's interesting, and not a houseboy or just an incidental guest who was there, but an attorney also murdered. And many of you, I'm sure, saw the article about ABSCAM, the stolen art that was returned to the home of Sidney Holtzman. Sidney Holtzman is the father of Elizabeth Holtzman from the House of Representatives. On some of the ABSCAM tapes, some member of Congress or persons working with organized crime were talking about trying to get Elizabeth Holtzman, I guess, entrap or entice her into some of these offers. And on the tapes, there's a remark, she's too clean. They couldn't work with her, that she's too clean. And so she's going to come out ahead when the trial begins, I understand, because they just couldn't deal with Elizabeth Holtzman. Her father was very unhappy, according to the Washington Post, that these pictures were retrieved by the FBI and announced so blatantly through their disguise of the Arab world. They were able to procure back 10 art objects, 10 pictures, and a bronze worth $50,000. And Elizabeth Holtzman's father said, in quotes, "Their announcement has made me a burglary target for the whole world. I'd call it sheer stupidity, But on the other hand, he has one oil painting that was worth $875,000 in 1961. He has 10 paintings and a statue of Picasso worth $75,000. And maybe the IRS will go into the income of some of these people who accrue millions of dollars of art objects and compare it, say, to their earnings, and maybe ABSCAM is going to bring in more than a lot of people imagine if you compare what is taken, such as the 2.3 million Titian that was at the home of the one gentleman who was murdered, where the two men were killed, and millions of dollars of valuable art that should be in museums that is very, very valuable is floating around homes, and I'm sure that there must be some comparison to what is earned in the method of procuring and the taxes on the income of getting these art objects, that as they pull in the stolen art scam, it's going to make a lot of people very angry. You can see why, embarrassed, and maybe investigated in the future. Met in New Hampshire. They were asked about Mr. Miller in the Federal Reserve, who's now Secretary of the Treasury, about the possibility of Textron bribing foreign officials for $5 million more for contracts, and John Connally and Philip Crane, George Bush and Howard Baker and Robert Dole said they were for honesty, but they couldn't pass judgment on Mr. Miller. At the time, they didn't have enough information. Judge Anderson said that he'd like to know more about Textron, and that if he was guilty, it was outright bribery, and that Miller should be canned for being a crook or dumb. Either one, he shouldn't be head of the Secretary of the Treasury. And Ronald Reagan came out for bribery. He said that it makes money. If it makes money, or if someone somewhere is doing it, I'm for it. As the San Jose Mercury said, Ronald Reagan came out for bribery the other night. None of his opponents argued with him, but he was very clear that he didn't see what was wrong with it. You may as well make a dishonest buck. The American Civil Liberties Organization, one that I stopped giving my small contributions 2 years ago as they defended the Nazi Party, came out in the New York Times article when ABSCAM stories broke. Bribery investigation disclosure called outrageous by ACLU. It's no more outrageous for the FBI to investigate murders, narcotics, gambling, prostitution, racketeering, extortion than it is to investigate why certain Republicans were at the Democratic headquarters in June of 1972. Ira Glazer, the ACLU's executive director, said the disclosures were outrageous and in an election year could stigmatize officials who might later be found innocent. I might say again that many of the people mentioned here, and we'll be going into those more on this tape or later, were already investigated or being investigated in crimes, and they were in the pockets of known criminals who already were charged with crimes, and the criminals or the middlemen proved it by just producing these men who came and stuffed the valises and even took stocks and so forth. They weren't getting innocent people. They weren't stigmatizing innocent people. And I don't know why the ACLU should be so quick to say that these arrests or the suggestion of arrests is outrageous. Keep in mind that only 2 arrests have taken place so far, and the story broke February the 2nd, and this happens to be March the 14th. 50% of the Congress is in the pay of organized crime. You can see why there's such a silence in the news media and everywhere about getting into this matter of catching mobsters and organized crime people. John Connally isn't in the races anymore, but John Connally could have an appointment for the Secretary of the Treasury once. He was Secretary of the Navy, and if he supports Ronald Reagan, for example, he may get a very nice appointment. I have an article that Lyndon Johnson was going to appoint John Connally as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Billy Graham wanted him Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. John Connally is wrapping the FBI, the ABSCAM investigations, and he says you shouldn't test the morality of public figures. Well, coming from Dallas, Texas, he knows what he's saying, because he said if you create circumstances and test their morality, you're enticing them to the lair. And as I say, his whole career is so filled with people that have not only been enticed, they came running. He had to defend himself as a sleazy operator, even in campaign speeches. But Mr. Edwards, Don Edwards of the FBI, and Congress is objecting to ABSCAM. The ACLU is objecting. John Connolly was objecting. It's a pretty sad state of affairs when they're so quick to close in and defend these known mob families and the links to organized crime that have spread in every city to cause so much pain in terms of burglaries, killings, narcotics, and the consequence of having so many people drugged and having to steal or kill to get a fix every night. It's about time we stopped some of this drug traffic in the United States. And even though it is selective in who they pick, I believe that the intent to get some of these mobsters is proven by the fact that they are bugging these streets and these restaurants and pulling them in. Howard Baker, the Senate Minority Leader, was another one urging Congress to act quickly, and he said, let's resolve the sting allegations. That was the week after the arrest. They were February the 2nd. By February the 11th, Howard Baker said, let's get an investigation going like the Watergate. And, of course, he sat on the Watergate investigations and went to Richard Nixon every night and tattled and squealed and worked against the House Select Committee as he sat on it. Senator Minority Leader, this is a quotation from the Washington Post, said to Congress, he said, the Congress will go down the tube, this is a quote, if it decides to sit back and wait for justice to take its course in connection with the videotaping of 8 of its members. I don't think the country will wait that long until they're properly investigated for their political influence being paid off with bribes. I think the leadership of the Congress should sit down together and say, look, this is as bad as anything that's been alleged against Congress since Teapot Dome, a scandal in the Harding administration nearly 60 years ago. We have a precedent of doing an honorable and thorough job on Watergate. Now let's figure out how we're going to do it now, today. Well, Baker is not running for president, but again, he could get a cabinet position. And his view of ABSCAM, and I think it's important, is that they should sit down before it gets like Harding's administration 60 years ago, that the leadership of Congress is involved. It's the biggest thing since the Teapot Dome scandal. And he said, don't sit back and wait for justice to take its course. We should do something now. The country can't wait that long. I love that quotation of Howard Baker's. Let's not wait till justice takes its course. The country, I don't think the country can wait that long, and he compared it to the Teapot Dome scandal. There was an article in the Washington Post, February the 19th, 1980, by Stanley Pottinger. He's from the Justice Department, a former Assistant Attorney General of the Justice Department, and it's called In Defense of ABSCAM. And he said, the FBI did not initially focus on members of Congress, but on interstate organized crime operation involving stolen securities and works of art. The FBI had been under pressure from Congress to focus its attention on organized crime and illegality in the corporate suite. They didn't stop there. Criminal suspects that they caught bragged having politicians in their pockets. That's what Mr. William Webster said of the FBI. Pottinger says one has to wonder if the instant criticism would be as loud if the targets of the probe were not members of Congress. He said the leaks of the operation are damaging to the whole affair, and should the government turn out to deliberately leak it, it would be terrible. It would be a severe consequence if they were doing that in order to protect those criminals once the story started to break. Pottinger wrote, he said, on the whole, ABSCAM, as well as Brylab and MyPorn and the 60 future investigations, the FBI's large pornography sting indicates that the Bureau is practicing what everyone has been preaching to do for years. Stop spying on domestic political groups, stop making easy cases that produce good statistics, and start cracking down on serious white-collar crime. Had the Bureau not followed up on the leads to public officials, one can imagine the criticism that would have been erupted or conjured up that the FBI refused to pursue clear evidence of official corruption, that fear of investigating Democratic congressmen in election year raises questions of administration cover-up, and so forth. They would ask, why did the FBI fail to follow clear links between organized crime and political office holders? In defense of ABSCAM, Stanley Pottinger said this is long overdue. This is what they were supposed to do why is everybody panicking now when the FBI is finally doing something, crime in the suites, that is long overdue? It's true that they may be getting a lot of Democrats in an election year, but that Pendergrass machine in Kansas and in the Midwest with Truman and the machines in Philadelphia, New Jersey, and Vegas are corrupt. The Democratic Party bosses are corrupt, and they are linked to organized crime and extortion and blackmail and some of the sleaziest operations. And if these acts are done by Democrats, get them out. You can go towards Republicans, too. But the Democratic Party is far from clean, and their links to crime are offensive. And therefore, if it comes to an election year, that's just the way the cookie crumbles. These stories had to come out, and I really don't believe they're just time to get Democrats. As I say, I don't believe that Watergate, a lot of that flaked off after the arrest of the hotel was specifically to get Republicans, and I think that the way it came down at that time is important. It didn't really affect the tone of Congress, and I don't think this should, too. But there are a lot of criminals and a lot of blackmailing and a lot of people kept in office because of murders and extortion and bribery and blackmailing, prostitution, child prostitution, payoffs, and everyone who's caught in it, even if 50% of the Congress, has to go get rid of them. And if it's bigger than Teapot Dome, so what? We survived that, and I think we would survive another Watergate, and I think that it's long overdue, and it's time to get on with the show. And I think that Pottinger's article is right. If they had these men that were arrested on small jobs and didn't go to the other story, they would have been blamed later. So, as I said, get on with the show and keep ABSCAM rolling. I want to stay with it to set a lot of groundwork for you so that you can follow it more closely. There was an article in the Washington Post explaining the FBI and their 50 undercover agents that are going into organized crime, and it said, only in the last 3 years since the passing of J. Edgar Hoover era, the FBI has systematically trained agents to infiltrate the heart of organized criminal groups. Undercover agents now carry off sophisticated stings that may begin with hijacked truckloads of stolen goods and end in probes of connections between underworld figures and politicians. This article says that studies of organized crime have shown it requires protection from public servants and local cop on the beat high up to the highest officials. According to the Justice Department, we consider that one important part of our attack on organized crime has to go with the public official. We have some ongoing operations that are pervasive of organized crime and political systems in parts of this country, starting with former Director Clarence Kelly, early 1970s, and continuing under Director William Webster. The Bureau has targeted its resources on white-collar crime, organized crime, and political corruption. You can't argue that if it's going to work and if they're really going to go into these people. Webster said, "We have no intent in testing any public officials. We have an obligation when information about criminality comes to us to run down leads and pursue them. Several hundred FBI agents have been trained with special courses. They take several weeks. They're learning a new language, and they, according to this article, are no shrinking violets. They are getting in the field and getting messed up and working with those people, the middlemen, the criminals, and the politicians that make them possible. For every person in organized crime that's allowed to work, there's a politician, according to Mr. Webster, who's making it possible for them to survive." Next week on tape 433, I'm going to continue with the ABSCAM story. I'm going to call it ABSCAM, but there are many more investigations. And we'll go into the area of the Southwest corruption that I briefly listed last week, and the Philadelphia connections, the Immigration Department, details on them and on their specific informants, who they are and how they broke the story open, and the Chase Manhattan Bank, and just one operation such as Allstamp with the PLO money going to violence overseas and weapons overseas, and the New Jersey officials and the Teamster connections. I'll go into more detail on specific personalities, not so much the goals, but how they operate and what's been learned about them so far, and the sleazy characters that have been caught in the net so far. As I said once before, these are not archangels that have been just tapped on the shoulder by people to be prosecuted, innocent little babes in the wood. These are people that were easy to catch because they were under the control of the crime lords. And I want to get into ABSCAM with a lot of detail for, as I say, next week and the week after, then get back to the general news, and then we can pick up individual cases like the Sindona case and isolated other pieces of information that I do want to keep up. I don't want to lose track of. But I think we'll stay with ABSCAM, and if you have interesting articles from various cities, send them to me where these stories are breaking, because I can't possibly collect all the newspaper articles that pertain to it. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. I'll sign off with a little of Mac the Knife from the Threepenny Opera, and I'll be back with you next week, and you take care until then.
Oh, the shark has pretty teeth, dear, and he shows them